We have agility, sustainability, and diversity. Let's have a look. So agility. Agility is a set of ideas. We're not talking about a specific agile approach, and I'm sure most of you will have heard of agile management. So we're talking about agility as a collection of ideas, and it's three main points. So agility and all of the agile approaches are built around three main ideas. Number one is you organize your tasks in iterations. Unlike waterfall, where you have one after the other, in agile you have iterations and you do the same. You don't do the same thing, but you review your process again and again and again. For example, every week you might have small milestones instead of having a big one every 3 months. And I have a lot of friends that work in the IT industry, developing software. And for example, they do like stand-up meetings every day, and they do a review at the end of every week. These are the iteration cycles that they go through. Reviewing, reviewing your project goals and plans. So often you see that you change your scope a little bit and the size of the project because you see that what you initially wanted to do is quite impossible in the time that you were given. So there might be a review. In a waterfall, that doesn't happen until close to the end, and it's a problem, obviously, because you cannot rewind the clock and go back. And the third one is open lines of communication with your stakeholders and the end user during the project. So, for example, you show people what you've been working on every month instead of after a whole year. The idea on Agile is that you show prototypes, for example, of what you're making, the product, or for example, the piece of software that you're making every couple of weeks to the end user, and you get feedback and you implement the feedback, and it goes on in such a circle of implementation and reviews. These are like the three main kind of ideas that we term as agility: iterations, reviews, and communication with the end user. Now, connection. When a team has agility, it means that we are open to making changes when necessary. And we're not saying make changes every time. We're saying make changes when necessary. When you get some negative feedback from the end user, for example, try to make these changes as early as possible. Number two, client focused perspective. Like I said, talk to the client often and show them what you've been working on, because they might say, no, 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 this is not what I want. I've made this mistake in previous employments where I sent something after a couple of weeks and the client said, that's absolutely not what I want. You should have showed me and you should have asked me along the process. And number three is you make sure that the stakeholders and end users are involved, and that helps you understand what they want more. Remember, we talked about stakeholder satisfaction and end user satisfaction at the beginning. So with agile approaches, we see that because stakeholders are more involved, they tend to be more satisfied from the end result of the project. Agility helps with that. Now, some recommendations. There's basically one recommendation which is quite challenging, but we found it to be a very interesting idea and very helpful for teams. So there is this approach now that is a fusion between waterfall and agile. And what do you have? You have a waterfall process, but inside that waterfall process, you have agile sprints. So what a sprint is in Agile is you bring a team together for a week and they work on one issue, one problem. Let's say, for example, you're making a digital game and there is this one bug in your game that you cannot solve. And you get a team together for a week and you tell them, okay, this week you will only work on that bug and nothing else. So this is a sprint. So in a big waterfall project, you have problem solving sprints to remove specific roadblocks. That's the fusion that a lot of organizations have created between waterfall and agile. And this is an opportunity for, I think, future project managers like yourselves. Now, sustainability, big discussion, public discourse. You know a lot about it, I am sure. We have all of these public figures talking about the environment, like Greta and like David. How do you pronounce his last name? Attenborough. I can never pronounce his last name correctly, but
David Attenborough.
Attenborough. Yeah, thank you. So environmental sustainability is at the forefront of public discourse for the last couple of years, and it will be at the forefront for a couple of years more unless we find a solution to it. Now, it was interesting that in terms of project management, there were three different aspects to sustainability and what project managers thought of as sustainability. A big part is about the well-being of the planet, environmental sustainability. How do we become more sustainable in terms of project management? But then there was this other opinion. How do I ensure the longevity of my organization? How do I ensure the financial sustainability of my organization in the middle of crisis, for example? You have the COVID crisis, and not all businesses will survive that, unfortunately. And finally, there was a third aspect, and has to do with social reasons and communities that these organizations work with. The well-being of communities. How can I have a positive impact in my communities? And again, of course, certain industries have different terms of sustainability in mind. If you work for a non-profit, an NGO, a charity, then the well-being of your community is more at the forefront, for example. Now, what is the connection of sustainability to success? Number one, you enhance the value of the organization. What does that mean? It's connected to number two as well. And number three, in a way, you enhance the perception, the perceptive value of your organization to people, right? So what is brand reputation and what is the brand value? Basically, it's how do people see you as an organization and what do they think about you? So when you work sustainably, when you support the right causes, and when you strive to be more sustainable, then that improves your organization's image. For example, if I walk into an office and I see printed emails that, you know, is not a great indication of how sustainable that organization is. And then you have better risk management. I think that's an interesting one. So when you start wondering how can I be more successful, you're basically questioning your operations and you're basically questioning also your risk. What is the environmental risk, but what is the financial risk as well? So you end up identifying more risks when you think about sustainability more. And finally, I think, in my opinion, and that is already the reality, it is and will be even more important, vital to attracting and retaining top talent because people do care about it. As well as with diversity that we will see later on, people do care about how sustainable your organization is. And personally, I wouldn't like to work for a lot of businesses that damage the environment. I'm not okay with that. If I can not work for them, I'd choose to not work for them. It's a big part of my values, for example. And I think for a lot of people now, it's a big part of their values. Then finally, some recommendations. What can you do as a project manager, as a leader in a business? Embrace environmental policies is one. When the government says something, don't fight it, but go along, examine it, see what it means for you. Which is number two. When you understand what it means for you, try to make these changes in your everyday operations. Don't just talk about sustainability because that I really don't like organizations that just talk about sustainability and then you examine them and you see that they do nothing. You're like, "Pfft, okay, it looks nice on your social media, but when we really examine it, you don't do anything. So have a think, how can I transform my operations to fulfill these expectations of the regulator? Because what will happen is when you sign a contract with the government, for example, and this is already happening, for example, in the construction industry, you will have to prove to them that you fulfill these expectations. And if you have already transformed your operations, then it's really easy to show that to your customers, and especially when your customer is the government, especially in the UK, that will become even more important as time goes by. So that actually brings in the money, which is counterintuitive a little bit because doing things sustainably is more expensive usually. But when you work with specific clients, they really ask you to be sustainable. So being sustainable will bring you more projects, depending on your industry, of course. Now, the last condition I'm going to talk about is diversity. Diversity is this other issue, very prominent in public discourse in the last couple of years. And how we define it for this project management discussion, because I think it's important to give a clear definition of how we define it in this context. We talk about educational, socioeconomic backgrounds, gender, race, religion, and nationality. What I mean by that is, what is your educational background? If you have a team of project managers, that you have engineers, managers, and economists, for example, or a marketing person, that is a diverse team. If you have a team where everyone is an engineer and one is a little bit of a project manager, then maybe you have to reflect on that a little bit. Socioeconomic backgrounds. In every country, you have different economic backgrounds, people coming from different classes, from the middle class, from lower working class, from high class, etc. It is imperative to employ people from all of these backgrounds because your organization, especially when we talk about the government, for example, they will give you insights. How does this project work in this context? When you go and redevelop an area that is working class, and you are not working class, you don't have a working class background, you cannot understand how these people view your organization that goes in and does something to their community. Then the same applies for gender, race, and religion. And I keep nationality separate because I'll tell you why. When you have different opinions in your team, when you have these different backgrounds, you can understand your team better. For example, let's say that you work in a project in London. London is super diverse. It's perhaps one of the most diverse cities in the world, right? So it doesn't make any sense for me to have an all white male team, for example, which is the case a lot of times in businesses. It doesn't make any sense. How will these people reflect on the reality of the communities they work for? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. I kept nationality separately because in the data that I've seen, nationality plays a big part when you run an international business or an international project. It almost doesn't matter what your background is when you go into a different country, even if we are, for example, all three of us in this panel are male and white, but that if Fred and Nicholas want to run a project in Greece, they're not going to have the slightest idea of how to run a project in Greece because despite what we might think, national cultures, do make a big difference in projects. So nationality does play a role when we are international, right? If I want to do a project in Sweden where Fred is from, then he will be super helpful to give me background and information. Now, connection to success. It makes a lot of sense in my head. You have a variety of ideas, you have a variety of experiences, and these all feed in to facilitate better problem solving and innovation. Imagine if you see the same face around the table and then everyone says, yes, yes, this is a great idea. Yes, yes, I love it. It doesn't, it doesn't make sense. If we all have the same backgrounds, then we'll have similar ideas, more or less. And it will just be an echo chamber where the same idea just is echoed from person to person. So having a variety of world experiences and having a variety of ideas leads to better problem solving and innovation. And I think in a very well connected world nowadays, where the internet connects everything and everyone, I think it's really, really not a good business practice to have a team that is not diverse. I think you are keeping a lot of ideas from reaching the table when you do that. And I've worked in diverse teams, and I think it's really, really good practice. Finally, some recommendations. Create an inclusive working environment. That statement kind of means nothing on its own, but I kept it that way on purpose because it means very different things based on your context, in the context that you will find yourself in the different industries. But I think for me, it's ethical. It's an ethical discussion. I want to commit to respecting everyone, to understanding their background as much as I can, and being inclusive in terms of listening to the ideas and asking for these ideas. And number two is policies, actual policies, things that work every day, that are set in motion every day, that promote diversity. I know that the government in the UK has a lot of these policies in place, depending, for example, when they interview people, etc. But some of these policies could look like extra training for disadvantaged groups, extra or mentoring or groups of support for minorities, for religious minorities, for example. Bringing these different cultures up to light, for example, can help people come closer together and understand each other. Because of course, with diversity, you kind of incorporate a risk as well, where people from very different backgrounds cannot communicate because they have very different backgrounds. So it should be a commitment of the organization to try to bring people together, to share their experiences and try to understand each other a bit better, in my opinion. And of course, having quota on how many people you employ from its different backgrounds is really important. Let's be very honest about that.
Thank you very much, Vasilis. Really appreciate your time, and it kind of just some really inspiring conversations and I think the key takeaway is definitely projects are complicated, and I'm a firm believer, and I think this is something I always impart, and that I'm a firm believer that there doesn't necessarily have to be a right or wrong answer. There's no in the worlds that I operate in. So, for example, in social sciences, I like to delve more into nuance aspect. I don't like to believe in absolute truths because I think a lot of these arguments are context specific, and what might work in one particular environment or one particular area might not necessarily be applicable at the same level in a different environment. So I think in that is the role in many ways of the project manager, to use their judgment and their critical experience and their expertise to make these calls and to analyze and apply what they think at that particular time will operate and what work and what won't work. And we had a really similar conversation, the three of us, with our colleague from the UKRI, Carl Barber, who essentially asked us a quite tricky question, which was, should you be judged on the success of your project at the end point? And I think the conversation we had, or the point that I made, was certainly about, well, let's not forget about stakeholder engagement. Let's not think about it in terms of the journey from where we started and how we got to the end point, or how we got to that. And for me, the success of your project is all based on the perception of your stakeholders and what their feedback is. So if my stakeholders are very much focused on one of the areas that you've outlined in today, then I would see it in that context, in that to bear more relevance, or to shape how I was to manage the project and deliver on the milestones in the endpoint. So I think, you know, it is really kind of complex, and I've got this idea, or this image, as you were doing the presentation, of, you know, a project manager essentially being a juggler and having all of these, but as opposed to a juggler having 8 similar round balls in the air in juggling does, it's like you've got a candlestick, an iron, a hat, a car, and you're kind of juggling all these different objects together, which makes it incredibly difficult. But no, thank you ever so much, Vasilis, and thank you, Fred, for joining us today. It's, as always, it's been a pleasure to go through this session together. Thank you very much, Vasilis. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.